On one fateful day, a man named Kevin Manis was running an antique store in Portland, Oregon, and regularly attended estate auctions looking for merchandise. Most of them were similar. Families would open a home, place everything out on folding tables, and sell decades of belongings over the course of a day. Kevin would move slowly through the rooms, picking things up, checking condition, and deciding what customers might actually buy. One sale advertised belongings from a woman who had lived past 100 years old and had survived World War II before immigrating to the United States. Her possessions filled multiple rooms. Kevin purchased a mixed lot containing dishes, small furniture, and a narrow wooden wine cabinet. While loading it into his truck, the granddaughter handling the estate stopped him and explained the cabinet had never been opened after her grandmother died. She referred to it as the Dybbuk box. Kevin understood the term from Jewish folklore as a malicious wandering spirit, but the warning sounded more like family superstition than a literal concern. He thanked her and took the cabinet with the rest of the items. Back at the store, he placed everything in the basement to sort later. The cabinet had a brass lock securing 2 small doors. Kevin worked at the clasp for several minutes until it snapped open. Inside he found 2 old pennies, a lock of blonde hair tied with string, a lock of darker hair, a small granite statue engraved in Hebrew, a dried rosebud, a gold-colored wine cup, and a single black candlestick holder. The items appeared sentimental rather than valuable. He closed the cabinet and left it downstairs. The next morning, his sales assistant, Jane Howerton, arrived early and went to tidy the basement before opening. She had worked there alone many times and knew the layout well enough to walk through it without thinking. While stacking boxes, she became aware of a sensation she couldn't immediately place, the feeling someone was standing behind her. She turned and saw no one. She continued working, but the feeling returned stronger. The building remained quiet. The phone rang upstairs and she left to answer it. While on the call, she heard glass breaking in the basement. She hung up and went downstairs, where another crash followed, then another, each sounding heavy and deliberate, as if objects were being thrown to the floor one after another. Jane called Kevin and told him something was happening while the breaking continued behind her. Kevin drove back immediately. When he arrived, the wrought iron basement door was locked even though he had not locked it. Inside, the lights were off and the switch did nothing. He retrieved a flashlight and forced the door open. All 4-foot fluorescent tubes were shattered across the floor, shelves were knocked over, and light bulbs were broken everywhere. Jane stood in the middle of the room shaking, walked past him, cursed at him, and left the store. She never returned. Kevin blamed her for the damage because he had no other explanation. Sometime later, Kevin gave the cabinet to his mother Ida as a birthday gift and stepped out briefly after presenting it. Alone in the house, she opened the doors and felt a sudden cold presence that prevented her from moving or speaking. When Kevin returned, he found her collapsed from a stroke. She tried to communicate, but could only point toward the cabinet while staring at it with visible fear. Kevin took the cabinet back. He attempted to sell it. An older couple purchased it, but returned it days later, leaving it outside the store and saying it carried an odd darkness. Unable to sell it, Kevin placed the cabinet in a storage shed behind his house. Soon afterward, he began having the same dream every night. In the dream, someone he knew slowly changed into an elderly woman with distorted features who attacked him physically, and he woke sore and bruised. The dream repeated nightly. Eventually, Kevin listed the cabinet online, describing everything that had happened and hoping someone knowledgeable would take it. In another state, a college student named Brian Grubbs noticed his roommate Sam reading the listing online. Not long after, Brian came home during lunch break and immediately smelled urine throughout the house. Sitting in the kitchen was the cabinet. Sam had purchased it. At first, it became a curiosity. Sam documented events in a blog and showed it to friends. During parties, guests gathered around it, and one night Sam jokingly placed a girl's hand inside the opened cabinet. Nothing happened, and they assumed the story was exaggerated. Soon, electronics began failing. Sam's laptop stopped working and had to be replaced. Then other electronics died one by one. A roommate woke with severely bloodshot eyes, and swarms of bugs appeared around the cabinet and crawled up nearby walls. Sam began reporting seeing things in his peripheral vision, and his blog entries grew serious as he tried to sell it. Jason Haxton, director of a medical museum, read the blog and purchased the box for twice the price because he wanted to test environmental causes. He scanned it for mold, toxins, and contaminants, but found only wax residue running down the front, as though candles had burned on it during a ritual. Within days of bringing it to the museum, computers crashed and erased weeks of research. Lights around it burned out repeatedly, and staff members reported sudden illnesses. They asked Jason to remove it, so he locked it in the trunk of his truck. That night, he dreamed of the same attacking elderly woman Kevin had described, and the dreams continued. One evening, Jason and his son were watching television when his son looked behind him and froze. Jason turned and saw a dense black shape behind the boy that vanished as soon as he focused on it. Jason moved the cabinet into the basement of an unused rental property and locked the room. At home, he performed a cleansing bath, but moments later felt a tearing sensation inside his body and began vomiting thick mucus, while his wife discovered a patch of bloody poison ivy rapidly appearing outside. Jason contacted Kevin. Kevin returned to the family connected to the original owner and met Sophie, the woman's cousin. She explained that before the war, a group of girls experimented with seances using an embroidered cloth as a spirit board. They believed they contacted a Dybbuk attempting to cross into the physical world, and constructed the cabinet as a prison to seal it inside. Using that information, Jason consulted rabbis and performed a sealing ritual. The cabinet was stored in a hidden location, and no further activity has been publicly reported. For now, it remains contained. One night, a woman named Amy Hoffman disappeared shortly before a holiday weekend. Her car was discovered in a shopping center parking lot, with the driver door open and her purse sitting on the front seat. There were no signs of a struggle nearby, and nothing immediately explained why she had vanished. That same day, Nancy Weber was preparing dinner at home when her telephone rang. Before she picked it up, she felt a sensation she recognized but rarely acknowledged. A strong internal resistance, as if she already knew the call would involve something she didn't want to face. She didn't describe herself as psychic, only that her senses sometimes became unusually heightened. When she answered, a woman on the other end begged her to help find Amy. Nancy told her to contact the police and ask for her directly. Not long after, Amy's body was found in a neighboring town. The investigation showed she had been murdered, and Captain Jim Moore was assigned to the case. He intended to move quickly before the trail went cold. The following day, Nancy read newspaper coverage describing the discovery. The report specifically stated Amy had not been sexually assaulted. Nancy felt certain that was wrong. She had experienced a clear impression that the girl had been raped and wondered why the information being released did not match what she sensed. Detective Bill Hughes, who had worked with Nancy before, stopped by her home for coffee. Nancy immediately confronted him about the articles and asked why the public was being told false details. She also insisted the killer would act again. A task force formed around the case, and Bill was part of it. They had very little to work with, only a vague description of a vehicle and an even vaguer description of a suspect. During a discussion, the lead investigator confirmed privately that Amy had in fact been raped. The statement stayed with Bill. He suggested they speak with Nancy. When officers were instructed to partner up, Bill approached Captain Moore. Moore was skeptical, but agreed to meet her. Nancy requested they not tell her anything further about the case before they left. They first drove to the mall, where Amy had disappeared. Without guidance, Nancy walked directly to the location where the car had been found. She described the area as charged with the energy of a traumatic event. Then she began describing flashes of what she saw: a green car, sudden movement, the sequence of the abduction. Her details matched evidence known only to investigators. They then drove to a wooded area connected to the case. As they approached, Nancy became visibly overwhelmed and said they were heading toward a murder site. Once inside the woods, she moved slowly, turning directions as though responding to instructions she could hear. She stopped at a specific point where there was no tape, no markers, and nothing visible indicating a crime had occurred. It was the location of the body. She described hearing Amy calling for help and feeling the attacker's emotional state during the assault. She said the victim had been cut and that the wounds continued after death. Nancy concentrated, attempting to see the man clearly, and began describing his build and features, but could not fully see his face. The investigators left knowing they were likely dealing with someone who would strike again. A second victim, Deirdre O'Brien, was later found at a highway rest area. A truck driver had seen a green sedan leaving the scene. Captain Moore recognized the pattern immediately. Nancy confirmed she believed the same man was responsible. During another drive with Moore and Hughes, Nancy described seeing books and shelves. The victim had worked at a restaurant designed to look like a library. They continued to the rest area. Nancy stepped out of the car and walked ahead. She described watching the green sedan pull into the same position reported by the witness. She said the driver removed the girl from the trunk, stabbed her in the abdomen, and threw her from the car before driving away. Nancy then followed the victim's final movements, describing her walking toward a parked truck and knocking on the door asking for help. She described the driver wrapping her in a blanket and the girl thanking him before dying. The truck driver later confirmed those exact events. Nancy focused on the memory repeatedly, trying to see the killer's face. Eventually, she perceived the scene from the attacker's perspective, but still could not identify him by name. The three drove through different towns for hours until Nancy suddenly asked where they were. When told, she said the killer held anger toward the local police department. She spoke with a police captain and unexpectedly began stating details she hadn't consciously known. She sensed part of a name, but the officer connected to it was on vacation and unreachable. Later, when the task force gathered, Moore and Hughes attempted to bring Nancy into the meeting. The supervising officer refused entry after recognizing her. Moore left the meeting in protest, and the three returned to the car. Soon afterward, Nancy became severely ill with a high fever, but insisted she felt imminent danger. She sensed the killer was stalking another woman and repeatedly heard the name James without a last name. Nancy contacted a group she taught in meditation and asked them to focus together so she could complete the impression. After concentrating, she felt a sudden release, as though the pursuit had ended. When Moore and Hughes arrived at her home, she feared another victim had been found. Instead, they told her a man had called emergency services, claiming he'd been stabbed. Officers arrived and found a green Chevrolet sedan matching the description. The man identified himself as James Kudetich. He claimed a woman had attacked him, but evidence showed he had stabbed himself. Inside the vehicle, police located evidence linking him to both murders, consistent with the details Nancy had described. The investigation concluded with the suspect in custody and the series of attacks stopped. On one fateful night, an officer named Dave Murphy reported in for his first training shift as a protective services officer at the historic Capitol Theatre. His training officer, Morgan Matthews, explained procedures and patrol routes, but avoided giving any extra details about the building itself. Murphy sensed Matthews was deliberately leaving something out, but focused on learning his duties. During a solo sweep, Murphy checked rehearsal rooms along a hallway when the men's restroom door suddenly slammed shut. The door used a hydraulic hinge and normally closed slowly. Murphy radioed Matthews and asked him to check the security cameras. Nothing appeared on the monitors, so Matthews came down to assist. With his weapon drawn, Murphy opened the restroom door and stepped inside. He immediately felt uneasy, as if something was waiting on the other side of the threshold. The room was empty. Matthews joined him and confirmed no one was present, yet Murphy remained shaken. They continued checking the building to rule out anyone hiding inside. On the second floor, Murphy noticed lights he had turned off were now on, and doors he had locked were standing open. It became clear Matthews had been withholding information. On another night, Matthews was monitoring the cameras at the security desk when he heard whispering behind him. The voices sounded like people trying not to be overheard. When he turned around, no one was there. He searched the theatre and reached the basement, where he smelled smoke as though a fire had started. The smell lingered, even though there was no visible source. Weeks later, during business hours, Murphy overheard a man discussing ghost experiences with 2 employees. He introduced himself and met Blair Fuller, the theatre's accountant. Fuller described working late one evening when the elevator motor suddenly engaged. Believing he was alone, he watched the car arrive at his floor and the doors open. No one stepped out. The doors stayed open long enough to trigger the alarm before closing again. When Fuller entered the elevator, the basement button illuminated by itself and the car moved downward. The basement corridor was empty. Back upstairs, file cabinet drawers began opening and slamming shut on their own, pulling him repeatedly away from his desk. Near the end of Murphy's training period, he and Matthews invited Murphy's friend Greg Gittins to visit. Greg had a reputation for sensing things others could not. They told him only that they were giving him a tour. Inside the auditorium, Greg paused and remarked they had not mentioned the building was haunted because he could see people standing around the seats. While walking through the basement, they approached an open doorway that suddenly slammed shut. The officers drew their weapons and approached as the handle rattled violently. Inside was an empty room. As they continued down the hallway, the temperature grew warmer. Greg smelled smoke near the same area Matthews had described and asked if there had once been a fire. He then turned toward a corner and said a young man was standing there, though neither officer saw anyone. After Greg left, activity intensified. One night, Matthews used a newly installed infrared monitor and saw a figure sitting in the audience as if watching a performance. The shape suddenly shot across the screen toward the camera with a distorted expression. After that shift, Matthews chose not to work in the theatre again. Murphy later worked alone and began hearing ragtime music echoing through the lower levels. He followed the sound to a piano whose lid was closed and which was not a player piano. The music stopped. Murphy left the building and said he would refuse further assignments there. Officer Josh Thomas replaced him. On Thomas's first night, he called Murphy, reporting the elevator moving by itself. Murphy returned to assist, and the two searched the theatre with weapons drawn. While Murphy stood across the stage, Thomas heard whispering directly beside his ear and then saw a dark head looking at him from behind Murphy's shoulder. Determined to understand what they were encountering, Murphy contacted a retired stagehand named Doug Morgan. Doug explained that years earlier the theatre had caught fire and hundreds of people were evacuated. During the emergency, a boy named Richard Duffin ran back into the building to help those still trapped. He became trapped in the basement himself and died while guiding others toward safety. After learning this, Murphy realized the presence in the theatre might not be trying to harm anyone, but reliving the place where the boy had lost his life helping others escape. Alright guys, that will be it for today. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss next week's upload. I drop new stories every week, so there's always something coming. I'll see you in the next one.